Welcome to episode 14 of Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobbie Holmes. This week, I have a story about the first Amish man to ever be convicted of a homicide. Trigger warning, this murder is very gruesome. I'll be discussing some pretty disturbing details that may give you nightmares. I know I've been lying awake thinking about it ever since a listener, Renee, sent me this article. But really, thanks, Renee. Keep sending those story suggestions. I know my rural Pennsylvania homies get it, but for those of you whose knowledge of the Amish comes from Weird Al's Amish Paradise, let me school you. I grew up in a very rural area, pretty much Amish country. I mean, it's not like we were next door neighbors, but close enough that we have signs warning drivers of horse and buggies on the road. The Amish keep themselves separate from the modern world. They live in their own small communities. Each Amish district is independent and they live by their own set of unwritten rules. The community strictly governs itself. Baptized members are morally committed to church rules. Their faith is just like that of most Christians, but they believe that living a simplistic lifestyle is the best way to serve God. Members who fail to adhere to the standards are shunned from the community. You're either 100% in or you're out. A short 30-minute drive from my hometown is the borough of Smicksburg. In 2019, the population of Smicksburg was 43. 43 total people. Like all Amish communities, people here live a simple life where modern conveniences are avoided. No electricity, no telephones, no automobiles, no batteries, nothing with an engine or a motor. Their simple life extends to their wardrobe. Women wear muted colors and their dresses must be at least calf length, tied with a white apron. Men wear solid colored shirts with suspenders, or braces as they call them. Men also wear wide-brimmed straw hats. Every woman wears a bonnet. The color of the bonnet shows their marital status. No need to check for a ring. In fact, they aren't allowed to wear a ring, or any jewelry for that matter, too flashy. Single women wear black bonnets and married women wear white. Men have a way of showing their marital status as well, with facial hair. Men grow long beards if they're married. But they have a unique way of doing so. They actually shave their mustache area and just grow a long beard. The Amish see mustaches as being affiliated with the military, which they strongly oppose. They live a life of non-resistance. They focus on peaceful resolution and conflicts. The Amish believe in uniformity. If everyone is the same, no one is better than anyone else. Individuality is not something they strive for. Amish only marry within the community, and there is no divorce. Families usually have about 7 to 8 children. The community has their own schools. Children attend school in classrooms until about age 14, then they continue learning skills on the job. Men work on the farm and are known for building homes and their handcrafted rustic furniture. Women spend their days doing chores like quilting, cleaning, and attending to the chicken coop. At age 16, Amish boys and girls are allowed to experience the outside world. They have a few years to decide if they want to become baptized members of the community. 90% of them return. If you decide you prefer the outside world, you aren't allowed back. You are shunned from your family and the community. Fun fact, Amish speak 3 languages. While they're at home, they speak Pennsylvania Dutch, which is a German dialect. They speak High German during worship and English to outsiders. In fact, everyone outside of their community is referred to as English, regardless of their nationality or heritage. This isn't a podcast on the Amish. I promise we're going to get to a murder here. I'm just trying to get you to understand what an Amish community is like. Throughout the state of Pennsylvania, there are many small pockets of Amish communities. Today's story happened in the Brown Hill Amish settlement in Rockdale Township. It's not far from the city of Erie, Pennsylvania. Ed Gingrich was born into an Amish community in Norwich, Canada. His family later moved to Brown Hill. Ed was considered somewhat of a rebel in the community. He was a slacker while working on the farm, and he didn't really enjoy going to church. It's not like he was a bad kid, it's just that he took interest in science and technology. He seemed more suited to live an English life. But when he left and had the chance to do so, he returned to be baptized as a member of the Amish Society. I think some teens return even if that's not what they believe in their heart because they don't want to be shunned from their families. Ed spent most of his time in his father's sawmill. He became fascinated with mechanics. There were very few pieces of machinery that the Amish were allowed to use. Amish are taught that technology and machinery were created by the devil to distract them from their devotion to God. Working in the sawmill, you deal with people from the modern world. Ed was constantly seeing people drive up in their cars. They would have conversations about things he dreamed about doing. It's the one place he felt like he had some connection with the modern world. Katie Shetler moved to the Brown Hill community at age 19. She was the niece of the local bishop. Katie had a late start compared to the other girls who typically pair up and get married in their late teens. Ed's parents thought that a woman with strong religious beliefs would be good for his wandering mind. However, Katie's family had mixed feelings about her pairing up with this rebellious man. The thing is, the community is so small, there aren't many options. Ed Gingrich was literally the only prospect left for Katie. At 21, Katie was at the age she felt like this was her last chance for marriage. So on December 6, 1986, the couple wed. There are no wedding dresses or anything fancy. You wear the clothes you wear any other day. You exchange vows and a dinner is served. After that, the community gathers to sing German hymns from the Bible. Soon after marriage, Katie became pregnant with their first child, a boy named Danny. Katie was thrilled to be starting a family, but Ed showed very little interest in being a father. He spent most of his time at the sawmill and very little time at home with his family. In the summer of 1988, something changed in Ed. He became very distant. He was sulking, didn't feel like getting out of bed, and had bursts of anger. Katie can't figure out what's wrong with Ed. Katie, girl, it's depression. She prays for him every day, but you can't pray depression away. When it comes to any medical needs, the Amish do not deal with state benefits or use insurance. They rely on self-help community support instead. They use herbal tinctures to treat diseases. They don't use any prescription medications unless it's an emergency. Having said that, I don't think mental health is something that the Amish are very educated on. The only thing the family could think of to do was to take Ed to visit the local chiropractor. He treated the Brown Hill community with homeopathic remedies. So do you know what this man was doing to help treat Ed? He was cracking his toes and sent him home with blackstrap molasses. Freaking molasses. I'm sorry, but what the hell is molasses supposed to do? Well, apparently it was going to purify his blood and cure his illness. While struggling with Ed's mental health, the couple go on to have 2 more children, another boy, Ennis, and a daughter, Mary. Katie feels stretched thin. She's essentially functioning as a single mother, and she's trying to explain Ed's strange behavior to the community. Ed and Katie were fighting more and more often. Ed resented Katie. She thought she was encouraging him, but really all Ed heard was nagging. The fights became violent, and Ed hit Katie on occasion. But Amish women are loyal. There is no divorce. Her only choice is to continue her marriage and keep quiet. The only place Ed felt somewhat at peace was at the sawmill. He enjoyed conversing with the Englishmen that came in to do business. Sometimes they actually drove him around at night, where Ed had another glimpse of the outside world. He befriended a man that he regularly did business with, a logger named Dave Lindsay. Dave told Ed that unless he left the Amish community and became a born-again Christian like him, that he would go to hell. Ed already had his doubts about the life he was living. Now with the thoughts Dave was putting into his head, Ed was in a downward spiral mentally. He shared his thoughts with Katie about leaving the Amish community. Katie was completely shocked. Being married to Ed was becoming unbearable for her. Ed began to experience hallucinations. He would lie in bed and he'd see a fly on the wall and spit at it. He was swiping at things that weren't there. To him, he saw eyes looking at him. His visions became more extreme. He believed the devil was trying to take over his soul. At one point, he jumped out of their second-story window and began running down the road screaming. One day while he was out doing chores, he began screaming and violently swinging an axe into the air at nothing. It took 7 men to restrain him. This psychotic break terrified his community, so much that they actually reached out to paramedics for help. They had to strap him down and sedate him. Days of testing at a hospital led to a diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia. Ed was prescribed antipsychotic medications. In this instance, since members of the community had never even heard of paranoid schizophrenia and they had no idea how to treat it, obviously, Ed was allowed to use these outside medications. The meds helped ease his symptoms of hallucinating, but he was left feeling emotionless and physically drained. He felt like a zombie. Ed was still experiencing paranoia. He felt like the doctors were feeding him poison, and he eventually stopped taking the antipsychotic medications. You can't expect mental illness to be cured after one visit with a doctor. He probably just needed to tweak his meds or the dosage, maybe some therapy. Soon after Ed stopped taking the antipsychotics, his schizophrenia returned. The men he saw daily at the sawmill had no idea Ed was mentally ill. They continued to try to convert Ed, filling his head with thoughts of doubt. They told him he was confined in that community and was essentially being held captive by his wife. This made him start to see Katie as an evil woman, the devil even. These thoughts continued to build up inside of Ed. The voices in his head were feeding on these paranoid thoughts. March 18th, 1993, Katie took Ed back to the chiropractor. He finally admits he is not able to help him. Toe cracking and molasses ain't gonna cut it. That evening, there was to be a wedding at the Brown Hill community. Katie was planning to attend, but she told Ed that she felt like he was too sick to go. She didn't want him to have any outbursts that would embarrass her. They had an argument over it. Ed felt like he was being left out. He laid down and took a nap in the living room. When Ed woke up, he walked into his kitchen where Katie was doing the dishes. Katie turned around to face him, and he punched her in the face. Now, Ed had hit her before, but it was never this forceful or violent. Their oldest son, 6-year-old Danny, was also in the kitchen and witnessed what just happened. Katie screamed for her son to run and go get help. Danny ran over a mile to his Uncle Dan's house. This was Ed's younger brother. Katie was left alone with Ed. At this point, she's now unconscious on the floor. Katie was left alone with Ed. At this point, she's now unconscious on the floor. Ed goes out to the mudroom and puts on a heavy pair of high-top boots. He comes back into the house and starts stomping on Katie's head. Ed crushed her skull and stomped on her so aggressively, her face was no longer recognizable. He scooped out her brains with his hands. Then he took a kitchen knife and cut her open from her neck down to the bottom of her navel. He gutted her like an animal. He removed every single internal organ and placed them neatly in a pile next to her body. The absolute worst part of all of this, his 3- and 4-year-old children watched their father brutally murder their mother. By the time Ed's brother arrived, it was way too late for Katie. Ed's brother, Dan, entered the house and stopped in his tracks. He just stood there in disbelief. Ed was standing beside Katie's body, covered in blood, with a crazed look on his face. Ed lunged towards Dan. He took off running to the closest English neighbor's house and called 911. When police were driving to the Gingerich home, they spotted a man walking down the road. As they get closer, they can see he was covered in blood. It was Ed. He was casually walking, holding his daughter in his arms and his younger son by his side. They handcuff Ed, put him in the back of the cruiser, and rush to the house to see if they can save Katie. Ed wasn't speaking, so they had no idea what they were walking into. The first EMS responder who entered the home immediately ran back out the door to vomit. Police describe the murder scene as a horrific sight that will be seared into their brain forever. It's just unheard of to see such a violent act within a community where they oppress violence. Ed was taken to the county jail to be interrogated. He didn't seem to have memory of what happened. The police had to continually remind Ed that Katie was dead. Here's a clip from the show Deadly Devotions. This was Season 1, Episode 1, A Murder in Amish Country.
I want to try to understand exactly what happened, why you killed Katie. Because, for some reason, I felt what is going to happen after we die.
Ed remembered no particular segments of the activity that took place during the murder of his wife.
For some reason, I think we can still save her. No, we cannot. I have seen Katie, and we cannot save her. Katie is dead.
They had to tell him that Katie was dead. And at times he seemed to understand that, and other times he didn't.
He brought God's name up a lot, the devil.
But we're getting again away from why you felt that you had to kill Katie. To get rid of the devil.
It was a war between the Lord and the devil. And he thought that Katie was the devil.
Did you hear Ed say, for some reason, I think we can still save her? He was delusional. During his interrogation, he over and over mentioned the devil and the fact that Katie was the devil. His interrogation was all over the place, not what I would consider a confession, but he obviously killed Katie, and he was charged with murder. He was moved to a mental institution. After a few weeks of treatment, he was starting to get his memory back. He showed remorse for killing Katie. He carried around a piece of her clothing, clutching it in his hands and sobbing. A year later, a trial began for Ed Gingrich. Every member of the Brown Hill community signed a petition asking the judge to punish Ed to the fullest extent of the law for his crime. The prosecution was trying to prove that Ed knew exactly what he was doing when he killed his wife. His defense team was not trying to prove his innocence. I mean, he definitely killed Katie, but to prove that he was insane at the time of the murder, which to me doesn't sound too difficult. I mean, there's documentation of his psychotic break and a visit to the hospital. He was prescribed antipsychotics and he was no longer taking them. The verdict was guilty of involuntary manslaughter, but mentally ill. This was a controversial case in the media. Charges went from murder down to manslaughter, and throw in the mentally ill part, his maximum sentencing was 5 years in prison. People were terrified at the thought of a man committing such a brutal murder would be allowed back into society so soon. But if Ed was found not guilty by reason of insanity, he would be in a mental facility, not prison. Ed was at least given the medication needed to treat his paranoid schizophrenia while in prison, but medication was as far as his treatment went. When the full realization of his current situation set in, Ed was concerned that God would not forgive him for his sins. He wrote letters to his family asking for forgiveness. He even wrote the bishop hoping that he could be accepted back at Brownhill once he was released. He never got any letters back from the bishop or his family. Ed served his remaining 4 years in a minimum security prison. In March of 1998, he was released without parole. But Ed had nowhere to go. He was shunned from the Brownhill community. So he was placed in another Amish community in Michigan. They didn't like that he was taking prescription medications and switched him over to herbal remedies, because that worked so well the first time. I can't even believe Ed would agree to that after what happened. Guess what? The paranoid schizophrenia returned. Duh. He frightened the community in Michigan and they asked him to leave. Ed's brothers lived just on the edge of the Brownhill community. They allowed Ed to come live with them, but that meant that they were now shunned as well. Ed wanted badly to reconnect with his children. Sometimes his 2 sons would sneak over to visit with him. His daughter, Mary, is now 17 years old. She followed the guidance of the bishop and kept her distance from her father. Ed and his brothers thought this was ridiculous. She is his daughter, and Ed is a free man now. He deserves to know her. They thought it was only fair if Mary got to know her father and then made her own decision if she wanted to be in his life or not. So they essentially kidnap Mary. They have an Englishman drive them to an old hunting cabin in central Pennsylvania. Ed's brothers lock Ed and Mary in the cabin together. Mary sat in fear, tears welling in her eyes. One of her earliest memories was witnessing her father kill her mother, and now here she was sitting next to him, alone. The bishop calls the police when he finds out what the Gingerich brothers have done. Ed was arrested for kidnapping and concealing the whereabouts of a minor. He pleads guilty and gets 6 months probation. The bishop offers a deal to Ed's brothers. He said they would be unshunned if Ed agrees to leave for good. Ed realizes the distress he's causing everyone around him, and he voluntarily leaves. His brothers return to their normal Amish lives. Once again, though, Ed has nowhere to go. George Schreck was Ed's attorney in his murder trial, and he had become a friend. George and his wife welcomed Ed into their home. Ed would feed the horses or whatever else he could do to help out on their farm. He was taking his medications and he was not showing any signs of psychosis. He was, however, still depressed. I mean, wouldn't you be? He got healthy and realized he dissected his wife like a science project. He's forbidden to see his family, shunned from his community. No one wants him around. He lived with the Schrecks for about 6 months. One day, while George was out hunting, Ed went down to feed the horses. When he didn't return, Mrs. Schreck walked down to the barn to find Ed had hung himself. Next to where he was hanging, There was a bucket with dust on the lid. He wrote in the dust with his finger, "Please forgive me." Ed's brothers asked their bishop for permission for Ed to be buried in the Brown Hill Amish cemetery. He agreed and actually allowed Ed to be buried next to Katie. This homicide has torn the Brown Hill Amish community apart. It is now half the size it was when it happened. Katie's family are still members, but Ed's family has since left. I believe some killers are born that way. Others are shaped into killers by their unfortunate upbringing. And some people suffer from treatable mental illnesses. I just want to stress how important it is to reach out for help if you feel like you're struggling with depression or any other mental illness. There is no shame in getting help. Talk to your friends, talk to a therapist, talk to a doctor. We just recognized World Suicide Prevention Day on September 10th. It's so important to normalize talking about mental health. If you need to talk with someone, you can call the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255 for free and confidential support. Most of the information about today's episode came from a show, Deadly Devotion. This was Season 1, Episode 1, Murder in Amish Country. It featured author Jim Fisher, who wrote a book about this murder. It's called Crimson Stain. I knew about the book, and I wish I had time to actually read it. Having only a week to research, write, edit, and upload, all while working full-time, has its challenges. The rest of my source information can be found listed on the show notes. Keep sending in your story suggestions. I like talking about cases that aren't as well known and have been done again and again. Send them to killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. When I hit 3,000 downloads, I'm going to do a giveaway for a custom t-shirt, and I'm really close, so make sure you're following me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Killer Stories Podcast. My podcast is really growing, but I need your help. Share it with a fellow true crime lover and leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on my Facebook page. I appreciate the support of my listeners. Until next time, this has been a killer story.